안녕하세요. And in the interests of, I don't need to hear myself, I think. In the interests of equity, with being the outsider, I will set my stopwatch so I don't take too much time. I'm going to talk about matching space to practice. And although I'm talking about teaching artists some of the time, I am a teaching artist, this practice really applies to many people who work in many fields. And I'm talking about the principles of emergent co-design for intergenerational creative spaces. And this picture really sums up many of the things that I think about design, is that although the toy can be very interesting to play with for a little while, it's usually the empty box that becomes the thing that has far more capacity for imagination. Just going to tell you very quickly about myself, because I've been doing this business for a long time. I trained as a fine artist, which many of us did, and interestingly, after hearing Fran talk, I worked in the 80s in London working with young people around urban design and how they affect their spaces around them. Taking you right up to the present, I now live in Tasmania in Australia. I'm nearly completed a PhD, and I'm very lucky that I have an Australia Council fellowship. And the Australia Council give out fellowships each year that allows me really for 2 years to do not quite what I want, but to push the agenda of what I'm about forward, and they kind of give me a lump sum of money which pays me to do that. It's a really lovely model. So my history, this is what I do. This is me. I've worked with children all my life. I love working with children and young people. And we used to print and publish books by them. There's me in Northern Ireland many years ago when I had some hair. Every child got one of these books, and they were hand-printed with great love and care. And these themes that I'm going to talk about will come through as principles of this practice. In 2004, I moved to Australia, and this is the building that I'm going to talk about a fair bit. This is a building called artE, and it is right in the middle of Melbourne. And we ran an enormous number of projects for children, young people and parents, and I will talk about that quite a lot more in this talk. In 2010, we opened another building called Signal, and this building was targeted at 13 to 20-year-olds. It wasn't so successful, and there are a whole range of reasons that I could talk about for that, but it was not as successful as artE. But we ran a whole range of programs inside, from graffiti art to, in many ways, standard teenage arts programs. And we had these amazing windows which were, I can't remember what they're called, but when you switch power on them, they become opaque, so you could project onto them from the inside. So we could project the work of the young people onto the building. One of the things I do most of now, this was my last trip here, this photograph, is work with artists. That's something I'm very passionate about now, is working and building the capacity of artists to, and we were talking about this before this session earlier, to bring artists and creatives further up the chain in the decision making. Because otherwise, inevitably, what many artists are doing is just delivering at the end. What I'm very keen to do is to support them to become leaders in different areas and to be involved in making decisions much further up the hierarchy and in the chain. So working with artists in a whole range of ways, teaching artists in New York, in China, in Korea, as part of a wonderful teaching artist network called ITAC, and a new project that we're running at the moment in Tasmania with local artists. Many of those are Aboriginal as well. Another whole session. This is a very important building. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Really, what I'm talking about here is the spaces that have been converted, and then within those spaces, how you can create spaces for fun, learning, magic. The magic that we know can happen with children and adults working together. This is in Dublin, and this was a building that came about from Dublin being the European capital of culture in 1990. It's called the artE, A-R-K. It's an extraordinary space inside. It had a purpose-built theatre for children, a workshop, and an amazing canopied opening at the back of the space that opened into a public space for performances. And I went there, and it was one of those places that when I walked in, I just felt, this is my spiritual home. This was Europe's first cultural centre for children. It was somewhere very special to me. And it had something about it which I'm going to try and encapsulate later in my diagrams. This is another one I'm slightly involved in through a research program, which some of you may know of, is a building called Playum in Singapore. And they have a very different model, very different system, but it is one of the other few buildings I know of in the world which is really designed specifically for out-of-school creative engagements with children and artists, teaching artists. So Playum does similar things, workshop spaces, and creative activities of all kinds for parents bringing their children. There are a whole range of issues around these buildings. I'm sure you may ask questions around where they're sited, whether they're serving disadvantaged groups or advantaged groups, or however. But I'm going to really focus today on the space because I have limited time. This was Art Play in 2002, and it was an old... there was a tram system in Melbourne, and they used to repair the trams and trains in this building. And it was just an empty shell when I first saw it. And I very amazingly invited over to Australia to set this building up. And that came about because I did a session with some people, and at the end of it they said to me, okay, if there's one thing we need to get this project off the ground, what is it? And my memory went back to the artE. And I was very taken by the director at the artE. He was somebody who could energize and create change, a kind of intrapreneur within the system. And I said to them, you need a really good director. And that's how I suddenly got the job, but I had no plans to beforehand. And I moved to Australia 6 months later, and very quickly we opened this building. So there it is. It's got a playground around it. That's when it was a very busy moment in its life. I'm no longer associated with it. I left that project 2 years ago, but it probably is open to the public about 230 days per year. It had about 28,000 visitors and employed 250 teaching artists per year. It's an empty box. It's a cardboard box that employs people to do things inside. So what's inside? Well, you know, really there isn't very much inside except the activity of the children and the people. And this was one of the very first things we did. Look, couldn't be much simpler. It's a painting studio. But that was probably in the morning. And that was probably in the afternoon. So it's about having a dynamic space that can change. I'm just going to run through a few photographs of some of the ways the space was used. We started working with schools, but we then stopped working with schools, largely because we felt best value could be achieved by working with adults and under fives. So a lot of our work was with early years children. So here, I mean, the reason I put this photograph in is because the spaces that are being used for learning or for education or for creativity are being defined by the users in the space. And I think that's what's interesting here, that really it could be anywhere. But having the round carpets, having these spaces breaks up that space internally, and that is led by the people who are running it. In many ways, it is an emergent co-designed space. I didn't really have the language for this before I started doing my PhD, which is interesting. I just did it. And like many of us here, you just do that. But as soon as you stop and really look and understand what you're doing, you can make more sense and more theory behind what we're doing. Again, you know, there's nothing in this space, but the energy that is happening here with one artist inhabiting the space is really worth just looking at for a second, because it's what happens. It's the magic between the artist and the space, or the activity. There were a whole range of things went on at artPlay, from you know, after schools making to dance clubs to various different programs. Visually being able to show off the children's work, letting them be owners of the space. Somebody mentioned this earlier about the users becoming the owners. We have to keep saying this over and over again, because there has to be capacity within a space for owners to decorate, inhabit, own it, make it theirs. Using the spaces in different times of the day seems very obvious, really, but it's an important way of keeping it dynamic and different, so that every time people come into the space, wow, it looks different, it's a different place. This was a Japanese artist who did some work with these beautiful lanterns that were lit at night, and then they were sent off down the river, and each one on it had an animal that had become extinct. So there was a political message coming through this work, but also a very beautiful piece. And this piece I was very proud of to have supported. And I'll give you the background to this, is we had a grants program that we could give out grants to artists. And from the very beginning, we had 4 adults and 4 children on that panel giving out the money. And that was quite a radical idea within the city of Melbourne. We were giving away $150,000 with children helping to do that. And this is one of the projects they funded. It was called RAIN, and it was a project specifically for very young children, toddlers and crawlers. And we employed 7 artists who we'd never met, really didn't know anything about them. We took a trustful guess that their work they would do would be good. And we gave them very little money. Artists are remarkably resourceful. We gave them, I think it was $12,000 to do this. And they've created a show called RAIN, which last week was at the Lincoln Center in New York. You know, this work actually has a legacy and goes beyond what we did. It had a live musician, some beautiful hanging structures, and some things that children could crawl around on the floor. Here again, this is a wonderful show for young children, using the circle, defining the space within the space. We do it all the time, and we probably underestimate that capacity. It's really another slide of defining the space. Those children were doing that. It's a pretty fun activity using dance and paint and lines. But really, nobody was looking at the rubbish bins and all the other things around the outside, because the focus had been led back into the center, a space for creating and learning. This is one of my favorite shows. This is an artist called Sally Chance, and she creates work for what she calls on-knee children. So you can see this show is quite extraordinary. It's a very small group of usually mothers and their children on their knees. And what happens in this show is the first 5-10 minutes the musicians are playing and the babies are sitting there. And then after 5 minutes, the babies start to want to crawl forward, and they come into the space, and the musicians come forward into the space, until you get this moment. And in this moment here, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make these spaces where the public, the most vulnerable public, a child, feels comfortable and safe and secure and trusting to move into, the artist moves into in a improvisational form, and they'd just make magic together. And it happened for about 10 minutes, and then the artist went back, and the baby went back onto the mother's knees. Creating internal spaces within spaces. I don't think you can see that photograph, but she's yawning and nearly asleep, that child. It's very nice. And sometimes we had the resources to support artists to do something a little bit bigger. And here was a program called Tangle by an Australian group called Polyglot. And they do national work, international work. And this piece was around children creating their own spaces by wrapping elastic. It got completely out of hand in the space in the end. It was wonderful. The spaces were too small for parents to be able to get through. It was only for children. And this is just torn up paper. I mean, how easy is that, really? Creating spaces. But it's about the intent to do that and the understanding. That's okay. We don't need big computers, setups, and everything. We actually just use torn paper. So what's the balance here? I'm talking about practice and the places that we design. Well, in looking at my practice as a teaching artist, but it could be a practice as a community activist or as an architect, my work is usually I try and be flexible. I try and be dynamic. I change the way I do things. I am very open. Fran mentioned about open-ended. Open is a key word. Emergent co-design. That is basically letting the space be designed and grown with and by the people you're with. It's relational. It is about talking and being with another person. It's uncertain and incomplete. Fran mentioned messy. It's messy. We don't know. It's never completely full circle perfect. Authentic materials. At artPlay, we never gave children poor quality materials. We would always focus on good quality and sustainable materials. So we wouldn't go out to the local store and buy rubbish. We would use rubbish. We would use garbage instead of buying garbage. Improvised. I'm improvising now. I've got no notes in front of me. I'm kind of making this up. It's one of the things that, on the whole, most of us probably in this room do really well. So we need to build a space that allows for us to be improvisational. We make, and then we remake. Making is something that is constantly happening. Seeing the materials as agents is important. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean allowing the materials to sometimes drive the activity. If it's a particular type of wood, go with the way that wood wants you to work with it. Go with the way that fabric wants you to work with it. And resourceful. I've said that we are all often have no money to be able to run programs, but we can still run good programs. We're very resourceful people. So these are some of my practice attributes, but everybody would have different ones. And this is not a definitive list, this is my list. But you could build your own list, or the children you work with, their list. Now this is quite a complicated diagram in a way, but after many years at artPlay, we tried to work out what was it that we needed to make, in the middle there, creative, inspiring and imaginative art experiences with children. This is the formula. No, this was our formula. Okay, so I'll just start over this side. So the place needed to be designed, an appropriate framework, safe, trusting environment with good resources, child-centered, adult, youth-centered. Whoever is in the space, it needs to be centered on them, not on the designer. Engaging practice. This is about the relational, understanding that space you have needs to be somewhere people can connect. Supported. We found that our front of house staff and administrative staff, everybody needed to know what we were doing and why we were doing it, because if they didn't know, they didn't really believe in it, and everybody had to believe in it. Exploratory, which is about play. First time I've mentioned that word, but play is very important. Spaces for play. Inclusive. ensuring the participation of diverse communities and offering multiple views of the world. That was something I think Fran again, or somebody mentioned earlier. And the last one is sustainable. We were having to encourage artists as much as possible to use sustainable materials rather than go out and buy new art materials. So that was our matrix. And really what I'm setting you the task of is thinking in your spaces, what is your matrix? And how do you design that? Well, you may design that with your team, you may design that with your co-workers, or even your participants. So if we have in the middle an intergenerational creative space, what do we have in the circles that we need to make that space work? They'll all be different. But I suggest dynamic is one, somewhere that changes. Look at this space here. We've already seen photographs of this space being lots of things. It can be lots of things. I keep going on about sustainable, but it's pretty critical that we use materials that are sustainable materials, not using up more and more of the Earth's resources. Enabling emergent design. I suppose ideally we could have given everybody a chair on the way in today, and you could have put your chairs out the way you wanted them. That does have problems, of course. Authentic materials. Using authentic materials, it embeds the values that you have in the work that you do. If you don't embed those values, why do we bother to do the work we do? We have to have those real values around authenticity embedded in what we do. Supporting relationships, it seems again one of the most important things that we all do in all areas of our work is to connect people. That's really what my whole life has been about, gathering and connecting people. So go away today and have a think about what your factors are that go into this diagram. So I did this and I thought, yeah, finished, easy. That's the presentation. And then I thought, well, why do we do this? What's the point of the intergenerational creative space? What do we want to get out of making these spaces? Sorry, I've jumped forward slightly. The advantages of some of the things I've talked about are often they're cheaper to fit out. They build an ongoing flexibility and dynamism. They rely on creativity in the space. They often have unexpected outcomes. There's a sense of ownership by the users. They're future-proof. You aren't putting in technology that's going to be out of date in 2 weeks' time. They rely on and foster trust, an incredibly important and often lost area of our culture. And they are most importantly inclusive of everybody in the space. So they're the advantages. The disadvantages, often you need more people to run the places because it takes more care and love. It's sometimes harder to sell to people who give us the money because they don't believe that it's going to work. They want to put lots of things in there, make it sexy and exciting. It also is reliant on the creativity. It's the same one. That can be a big disadvantage, and that there are unexpected outcomes. But somebody spoke earlier about creating the laboratory or the factory for failure. Failing's important. We have to fail. That's how we learn, isn't it? So we've got this space with all these things around. Then I was thinking, well, what do we get out of this? Why do we do this work? What is it that we do it for? What are the outcomes of this design process? Again, they're many and varied, and you will have your own. I have 3, I think I've put here, which are fairly obvious. Community. Building a sense of community. Now that can be a geographic community, your locality. It can be a community of children across the whole country. It can be a community of artists who are connected, who are doing this work. It can be multiple levels of community. Learning. We tend to use the word learning rather than education in a way. Education in Australia would be seen as slightly limiting, whereas learning can happen anywhere at any time with any age. And a word that has come up a lot today is agency. That is the reason, for me, why we are doing this work, particularly with children. We want to give children agency and families agency who would not normally have that power and capacity to shape their own lives the way they want them to be through creativity. So those are just three, and again, I put a question mark in the last box because I want you, to go away today and think, well, we all know this, but it's actually been really interesting to write it down and very useful to try and diagrammatize this idea. So that's why we do it, to create loads of huge social and community value and individual value. My PhD is very much about why the arts is important for ourselves to connect to ourselves and for ourselves to connect to our communities. I just wanted to show this picture at the very end because this is another thing you can do with a cardboard box. It was an artist we had who sadly died a few years ago. She was a very special person from Sweden. From Denmark. I apologize, Denmark. She asked the children to make little galleries to put in the boxes, and then they put the boxes on their back, and they carried them through the city as mobile art galleries. I think it was just such a lovely, simple idea of a way of using a cardboard box. One of many, many different things you could do. And the kids were just so proud of carrying their exhibitions around with them. That's all I want to say, really. I think it's really about those factors of how we operate, our core values, and how if we're designing any kinds of spaces, thinking about any kinds of spaces for education, we need to just remember those values, remember how important they are. Those are some of the links to ArtPlay, the ARC. KidZone is the one that does the publishing of the books by children. Signal was the teenage project, and Playum is the one in Singapore. And I am at 27 minutes, 3 minutes short. So thank you very much.